One of the quieter lessons of the Korean War is how quickly confidence in modern protection collapsed once weather and logistics took control. By 1950, military planners believed reinforced bunkers, prefabricated shelters, and centralized supply would prevent the exposure disasters of earlier wars. Instead, cold weather injuries, shelter failures, and preventable exhaustion returned with alarming speed. What became clear, often too late, was that many of the most reliable shelter practices were not modern at all. They were inherited, sometimes unconsciously, from World War II. That realization still matters. If you're interested in military history that examines why certain practices endured rather than why others looked advanced, consider subscribing to Echoes of Valor. This channel exists to explore the knowledge that survived contact with reality, not just doctrine. World War II forced soldiers to solve shelter problems under constant pressure, with limited materials, and in environments that punished mistakes immediately. The shelter hacks that worked were not clever tricks. They were disciplined responses to how heat, moisture, wind, and fatigue actually affect the human body. 5 of those approaches still work today, not because technology stalled, but because the fundamentals of exposure never changed. Digging down consistently protected soldiers better than building thicker walls. One of the most enduring World War II shelter lessons was that depth mattered more than strength. Soldiers learned that earth was a more reliable ally than concrete, steel, or sandbags alone. A shelter dug into the ground reduced wind exposure, moderated temperature swings, and absorbed shock far more effectively than surface-level structures. During the Korean War, many modern bunkers failed, not because they were weak, but honestly, because they sat exposed. Wind stripped heat faster than insulation could compensate, and snow, well, it accumulated unevenly, collapsing roofs and blocking entrances. WWII-style dugouts actually avoided many of these problems by using the surrounding earth as insulation and protection. This principle still holds in 2025. From emergency shelters to cold weather survival techniques, going down remains, one of the most effective ways to stabilize internal conditions without relying on complex materials or constant maintenance. So, a common mistake among inexperienced troops in World War II was oversealing shelters. The instinct was pretty understandable. Block the wind, trap warmth, and eliminate exposure. But what followed instead was moisture buildup, condensation, and stagnant air that, over time, soaked clothing and bedding. Veteran soldiers, learned to build shelters that actually breathed, that small ventilation gaps placed deliberately allowed moisture to escape while still retaining heat. In cold climates, this smart approach prevented frost accumulation inside shelters, and in warmer regions, it reduced heat stress and respiratory illness. Korea reinforced this lesson harshly. Oversealed bunkers became damp, unhealthy spaces that weakened the very soldiers they were meant to protect. Modern shelter design, from military field tents to disaster housing, still reflects this World War II-earned understanding that breathable shelter outperforms airtight shelter over extended periods. Another World War II shelter practice that continues to save lives is elevation from the ground. Soil conducts cold efficiently and retains moisture long after surface conditions change. Soldiers who slept directly on the ground lost heat faster and suffered higher rates of illness and injury. During World War II, veterans learned to elevate sleeping surfaces using whatever was available: wooden planks, branches, packed earth platforms, or even crates. Even just a minimal separation from the ground dramatically reduced heat loss and really improved recovery during rest periods. In Korea's winters, this distinction became absolutely critical. Elevated sleeping arrangements reduced the risk of frostbite and improved sleep quality, which in turn directly affected alertness and decision-making. Today, the same principle is standard in modern survival training, cold weather camping, and emergency shelter design. Ground separation remains, honestly, one of the simplest and most effective protective measures out there. You know, World War II also taught soldiers an important lesson. No shelter could compensate for poor placement. A well-built structure, if placed in the wrong location, could invite flooding, wind tunneling, collapse, or even exposure to blast effects. It's all about where you put it. Experienced troops, well, they learned to read the terrain very carefully before digging or building anything. They favored leeward slopes, natural drainage paths, and ground that could be shaped without pooling water. It was all about understanding the land. Tree cover. Now that was used cautiously. It was all about balancing wind protection against the risk of collapse or falling debris. These decisions, they were often made instinctively by soldiers who had seen the consequences of bad placement before. They knew what could go wrong. During the Korean War, units unfamiliar with these lessons suffered repeated shelter failures when snowmelt flooded positions or wind stripped heat from exposed sites. Modern survival doctrine continues to emphasize site selection first, because World War II demonstrated that placement determines success long before materials come into play. Perhaps the most overlooked World War II shelter hack was the mindset behind construction. Experienced soldiers did not treat shelters as finished projects. They treated them as systems that evolved. Drainage channels were adjusted after storms, roofs were reinforced incrementally, walls thickened as materials became available. Temporary shelters that worked for a night often failed over weeks. Moisture accumulated, structural weaknesses appeared. Veterans responded by modifying designs continuously, guided by observation rather than original plans. In Korea, rigid bunkers often failed because they could not adapt. When conditions changed, the structure became a liability. WWII-style shelters endured because they were forgiving and adjustable. This lesson carries forward into modern disaster shelters, remote research stations, and long-term field operations, where adaptability often determines survival. What these shelter hacks reveal is that endurance always outlasts optimization. None of these World War II shelter practices were dramatic. They did not rely on advanced materials or precise engineering. They worked because they respected environmental reality and human limits. They reduced long-term strain rather than chasing short-term comfort or theoretical protection. The Korean War exposed what happened when these lessons were ignored. Modern bunkers looked impressive but often failed the slow test of exposure. World War II shelters, built under harsher conditions and with fewer resources, endured because they aligned with how heat moves, how moisture behaves, and how the human body survives stress. These shelter hacks still work in 2025 because they were never about the war that produced them. They were about survival itself. Remembering these lessons matters because future crises will not arrive under ideal conditions. They never do. If you value historical analysis that treats survival knowledge as something earned rather than assumed, subscribe to Echoes of Valor and share this video with others who care about serious military history. The past continues to offer guidance if we're willing to learn from it.